If the Cold War had turned hot and the proverbial had hit the fan, for many Russians the last thing they would have seen was formations of this aircraft delivering nuclear bombs over the Soviet Union. The Avro Vulcan B-2, an iconic delta-wing bomber that fortunately for everyone was never called upon to do what it was designed to do, be Britain's contribution to nuclear Armageddon. Designer Roy Chadwick also designed Britain's other iconic 20th century bomber, the Avro Lancaster, headed up the team that created the futuristic Vulcan, which entered Royal Air Force service in 1956. For 26 years, the Vulcan was at the forefront of Britain's nuclear deterrent, but none ever flew a mission in anger until 1982, when a rather unexpected conflict suddenly broke out 8,000 miles from the UK in the wastes of the South Atlantic, the Falklands War. Argentina decided to invade the colony, which had been a British territory since 1833, and the associated territories of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands in April 1982. Judging that forthcoming defence cuts announced by Margaret Thatcher's government would mean no military response from Britain. In this, the Argentine dictatorship was sorely mistaken, and Thatcher determined to dispatch a powerful Royal Navy task force built around 2 aircraft carriers to reclaim the islands. Logistically, the challenge of mounting an amphibious invasion so far from home was daunting for the British Armed Forces. Argentina, only 400 miles from the Falklands, moved a sizable garrison to the islands, backed up by jet fighters and a reasonably modern navy. As the task force steamed south, its commander, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, requested targets to attack in the Falkland Islands. After considering targets in Argentina itself, it was decided to let the RAF have a go at knocking out Port Stanley Airport near the Falklands capital, which was being used by Argentine Air Force units. These aircraft and facilities could be used against the task force's ships and the planned amphibious landing by Royal Marines and the Parachute Regiment. Sea Harrier squadrons were mounted on both of the British aircraft carriers, but London felt that using RAF Vulcan bombers to attack Stanley Airfield would help conserve the task force's valuable Sea Harriers for warship protection and other tasks. The Vulcans would also be capable of carrying a huge bomb load, up to 21 1,000-pound bombs. But Britain faced some serious problems. Firstly, the Falklands War broke out just as the RAF was phasing out the aging Vulcan. Only 3 squadrons still possessed the type. The stock of spares was limited, and aerial refueling systems would have to be rebuilt after being blocked with filler. Even finding enough 1,000-pound bombs of the correct type was a challenge. 6 aircraft were eventually selected for the raids, but how to get them to the Falklands and back? The plan was, to say the least, ambitious. The Vulcans would operate from Wide Awake Airfield on Ascension Island, another British colony in the Atlantic. It was 3,300 nautical miles, or 6,100 kilometres from the Falklands. In order to reach Stanley, bomb and return to Ascension, a Vulcan and a second reserve backup aircraft would require a total of 11 refueling tankers to refuel the Vulcans and each other. The RAF turned to another V-bomber, the Hanley Page Victor. The RAF's Victors had been converted into tankers, but the RAF only had 23 left in service. By the end of April 1982, the RAF had 14 Victors at Ascension Island. The bombing missions were codenamed Black Buck. Black Buck 1 was launched on the night of the 30th of April to 1st of May 1982. 2 Vulcans were involved, one acting as backup, plus 11 Victor tankers. In total, 18 aerial refuelings would be required during the mission. The primary Vulcan suffered a window seal failure after takeoff, which meant the crew cabin couldn't be pressurized. The reserve Vulcan XM607 performed the raid instead, dropping 21 1,000-pounders across Port Stanley runway, one bomb creating a large crater in the runway itself. 3 Argentines were killed and several injured. Backing up this attack, 9 Royal Navy Sea Harriers struck the airfield with bombs, one Sea Harrier being damaged by 20mm anti-aircraft fire. The primary aircraft for Black Buck 2 was again XM607, which flew a virtually identical sortie to the first mission on the night of the 3rd to 4th of May. But this time, the bombs all missed the runway, but craters at the end of the runway prevented Argentine engineers from extending the runway to accommodate fast jet fighters, which would have been a serious problem to the task force. Only lighter aircraft and Hercules C-130s could use it. Due to strong headwinds, Black Buck 3 was scrubbed on the 14th of May. Black Buck 4 was also scrubbed after the 2 Vulcans were 5 hours into the mission, again due to weather. This mission was the first to carry the American-supplied Shrike anti-radar missiles, the intention being to destroy an Argentine Air Force Westinghouse AN-TPS-43 long-range 3D radar deployed at Stanley Airfield, that gave the Argentines good all-round coverage of the Falklands. But the attack with the Shrike missiles would only work if the Argentines switched the radar on when a Vulcan was in the vicinity. Black Buck 5 also targeted this powerful radar. A Sea Harrier raided when Vulcan XM597 appeared, and the Argentines helpfully switched the radar on. XM597 launched 2 Shrike missiles. One impacted 10 to 15 yards, or 9 to 14 meters from the radar, but did not knock it out. The second completely missed. Primary aircraft Vulcan XM597 was tasked with repeating the mission flown on the 31st of May, designated Black Buck 6. Piloted by squadron leader Neil McDougall, XM597 was armed with 4 Shrike missiles instead of 2. Flying reserve was Vulcan XM598. McDougall's mission occurred on the 3rd of June 1982. On arrival over the Falklands, the radar was not switched on. McDougall loitered for 40 precious minutes, hoping that the Argentines would switch on their radar, but no luck. Instead, 2 of the Shrikes were fired at another radar system, destroying a Skyguard fire control radar for guns of the Argentine 601st Anti-Aircraft Battalion, killing 4 operators. But the action was going to hot up for XM597 as she headed for ascension. During a refueling from a Victor, the probe snapped off, meaning that XM597 could no longer take on fuel. She was thousands of miles from base and flying at 45,000 feet over the Atlantic when the drama began. McDougall faced 2 choices: either ditch the Vulcan in the ocean when the fuel was exhausted, or find the nearest land and put her down. He chose the latter. The closest landfall was Brazil, 700 miles to the west. It would be tight. The Vulcan barely had enough fuel left to reach the airport at Rio de Janeiro. The next problem was obvious. The Vulcan was still armed with 2 Shrike anti-radar missiles, weapons quietly supplied to Britain by a supposedly neutral United States that intended to maintain friendly relations with both the UK and Argentina. McDougall decided to get rid of them. One was successfully launched into the sea, but the other refused to budge. The last missile could not be fired. A second problem were sensitive documents, maps and other material on board that Her Majesty's government would have preferred not to fall into the hands of foreigners. But how to get rid of this material? McDougall had no choice but to depressurize the aircraft at 45,000 feet and have the crew open the main hatch and dump the material at sea. With the crewmen on oxygen, fuel running out, and 2 of them struggling to try and close the crew hatch as the temperature inside the aircraft began to plummet, an emergency was declared to Rio de Janeiro Air Traffic Control. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is a British 4-jet approximately 500 miles east of Rio de Janeiro at flight level 430 with an in-flight emergency and very short of fuel. We request an immediate diversion to the nearest suitable airfield. This is Brazil Control. Please say your call sign, your country of departure and your destination. This is Ascot 597, a British 4-jet with 5 souls on board, critically short of fuel, and with no cabin pressure. We request immediate assistance and permission to divert to the nearest suitable airfield. These exchanges went on for some time, the Brazilians constantly demanding that the aircraft identify its point of departure. The Brazilian control also refused them permission to land. Navigator David Castle from Yorkshire, who is struggling with the door, shouted at the radio operator, "For goodness sake, tell him to be quiet while we handle this emergency. If he won't be quiet, tell him we're from Huddersfield." This is exactly what the radio operator did. Calling up Rio Control, he said, "This is Ascot 597. We are a British 4-jet in an emergency, desperately short of fuel, and we are from Huddersfield." Squadron leader McDougall, in the meantime, spiraled the Vulcan down to 23,000 feet and headed for Rio. In the meantime, the Brazilians scrambled 2 Northrop F-5E Tiger II fighters from Santa Cruz airfield to intercept the Vulcan. When McDougall landed at Rio Airport, he had less than 2,000 pounds or 910 kilos of fuel remaining, sufficient not even for one circuit of the airport. It was an embarrassing situation for the British government, and even more so for that of the United States, which had supplied Britain with the Shrike missiles, one of which was still on its underwing pylon aboard the Vulcan. The British crew were interned by the Brazilians, and the Brazilian government initially refused to release either the crew or the aircraft. However, on the 4th of June 1982, a deal was struck behind closed doors to release the plane and crew in exchange for spare parts for Lynx helicopters operated by the Brazilian military and built in the UK. The intervention of the United States was also critical in attempting to preserve the secrets of the Shrike missile. On the 10th of June, the Vulcan and her crew were permitted to fly to Ascension Island. There, a new refueling probe was fitted. The aircraft then flew back to RAF Waddington on the 13th of June. But the Shrike missile, well, that remained in Brazil. The day before XM597's release, the last Black Buck mission had been flown against Stanley Airfield. Following a British amphibious landing and a series of tough battles in the mountains around Stanley, Port Stanley itself was captured and the Argentines surrendered on the 14th of June 1982. The employment of the Vulcan in the Falklands has been criticised by many commentators, but the Black Buck missions demonstrated how even the seemingly impossible could be achieved with careful planning, logistics and daring aircrew. Unfortunately, Black Buck proved the swan song of the Vulcan, which left RAF service in March 1984. Special thanks to the staff at the City of Norwich Aviation Museum for granting me access to Vulcan XM612, which had been due to be lead aircraft for Black Buck 3. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box.